Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our seventh Coffee with a County Forester. Vermont Coverts and Vermont Woodlands Association has been bringing this morning program from the beginning of our quarantine. And it's been a lot of fun. We've been meeting each of the county foresters through our time. This week we have Hannah Dallas, who's the Southern Windsor County Forester. I'm going to ask all of you to mute your mics and we'll use the chat box to ask questions. If you have anything to ask Hannah, she'll give a little introduction and then we'll back and forth with questions, Hannah and I and Kathleen. And yeah, and we'd love for you, if you want to know about these and other programs, to sign up for our e-news on both of our websites. You can do that. You can also join Vermont Woodlands Association and support Vermont Coverts with a donation so that we can continue to bring you these kinds of programs. Again, thank you for joining us this morning. And at this point, I will turn it over to Hannah.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I am the Southern Windsor County Forester, so I cover the biggest county in Vermont, so there's a lot of landowners in this county. So I cover half the county, which is a little bit unique. Most county foresters cover an entire county. But I administer the current use program, which most of you probably know about, but it's a program in Vermont where landowners that have 25 acres or more of forest land, they can enroll their land and get a tax break and keep that land as a large contiguous forest block rather than feeling some pressure from development and feeling like maybe they can't afford the taxes if they kept it as one large block. So if they're in the program, they have to follow management guidelines and standards of management. And I oversee that and really help to teach landowners what they can do to do good forest management and just be a resource to those landowners, and work with consulting foresters to do good management on the ground. I've been in this position for about a year and a half, but I was with Forest Parks and Rec for about 2 years before that, working with the NRCS program. So I did a lot of work with helping private landowners do invasive work, plan invasive work on their property to get funding for that through NRCS, as well as some habitat improvement work, patch cuts, mass tree release, and then some timber stand improvement work. So doing things before it was commercial, doing a lot of TSI, timber stand improvement, to better their forests and kind of set them up for a successful future in managing their forests. So I'm pretty familiar with invasives. That's a popular topic, and I carried that through to my county forester work, and I'm pretty passionate about invasive species control and also doing TSI work. So doing work that's pre-commercial and setting yourself up for success in the future. It's a little bit of my background. Along with the UVA administration of the program, I also do education programs, kind of like these, although usually they're in person. I've been doing a lot of emerald ash borer talks for some of the towns, and hopefully we can continue those this summer. It's kind of encroaching on our borders, and we're finding emerald ash borer in new places, and so we want to keep that on people's minds. Even though the pandemic is like a human impact, we still don't want to forget about the forest impacts that we're dealing with. So I'm hoping we can continue some of those emerald ash borer talks and keep people thinking about managing for emerald ash borer coming up. I guess that's my introduction, and if anybody's got questions, I'm happy to answer them.
While we wait for people to kind of type into the chat box, let me ask you a few questions to start out. So what do you think are some of the biggest threats to our Vermont forests right now? What should landowners be concerned with?
So I think invasive pests of all types is kind of the biggest concern, I would say. really threatens, each invasive threatens a different kind of aspect of the environment, but we have the invasive insects like emerald ash borer that, and like hemlock woolly adelgid, that threaten our forests and are attacking a lot of trees all at once. And so we could lose species or see them greatly diminished if we don't kind of take preemptive actions and try to shore those up, trying to do good management. And invasive plants threaten other aspects of the forest and species, and have really a big trickle down effect on what they're impacting. So anything from soil pH and soil composition, and therefore other species that will grow in that area, to light on the forest floor. And like now we're seeing ephemerals coming out, spring ephemerals. But if they don't have the sunlight because they're being overshadowed by invasives, then we're going to lose those. So species diversity is being affected. And just overall regeneration of our forests and our native species composition, and forests as a whole, if they can't regenerate because there's invasive plants in the area, then we're at risk for losing our forests in general if we don't think about that. So I think invasive species, there's a lot of things you can talk about and how they impact things, but I think that's one of the biggest threats, because there's just so many little pieces to it. I think there's also fragmentation always comes up as a threat, and development, and as we have more and more people in the planet, people want land, especially now. We're kind of noticing that that there are a lot of people looking at Vermont as a nice place to live because you can own a little piece of property and get outside during this pandemic where a lot of people in cities can't. So that's always a risk, is that development pressure. I think those are kind of the two big ones, that a big umbrella topics, and then there are lots of other things that fall within those.
Great, great. Jock had a question for you. He said you once visited and found native honeysuckle on his property. So he's since found 2 more individuals, but the deer have been eating them. And he's thinking of surrounding them with wire fencing. Wondering your thoughts on that. And I also wish you would tell people a little bit about honeysuckle and how to tell invasive honeysuckle, which is mostly what we have, from this kind of rarish native honeysuckle.
Yeah, I love finding native honeysuckle. I think it's so cool. So native honeysuckle, like its name, like it was here before we had the introduced non-native species, and there's a few introduced non-native species. I try to just keep it simple and talk about invasive versus invasive versus native. But the invasive honeysuckle, my first instinct on how to describe it is that it just looks like it belongs, compared to non-native, which looks kind of bullyish on the landscape. It's non-native is always trying to edge out other species, and it's usually crowding things out, and it's pretty big, and it will you'll usually see lots and lots of it. You may just see one if you're lucky, but usually you see lots and lots of it, and the shrubs are big. So native honeysuckle almost always is kind of below the knee, I would say. It's closer to the ground. Invasive honeysuckle is a larger plant. It will start out closer to the ground, so it can be a little bit tricky to tell them apart if it's young. But invasive honeysuckle, it gets really big, over your head, chest height. And then another couple of ways to tell them apart is that invasive honeysuckle, when you break a stem, it has a hollow stem. So it will kind of snap and pop open. So native honeysuckle, sorry, the names are a little tricky to keep apart, but native honeysuckle, the stem is solid. And then if you have leaves, another good way to tell is that invasive honeysuckle, doesn't have anything on the leaf margin. Native honeysuckle has these little tiny, like translucent almost hairs that come off the leaf margin. You have kind of the honeysuckle leaf, and then there's just, if you look really closely, maybe if you have a hand lens, you can see these tiny tiny hairs, and that's a good way to tell also. But generally people go for the hollow pith as their first method, and then just looking around too, and being observant of, do you see more of it? Do you see it kind of crowding other things out, or does it look like it's in its niche? The native honeysuckle really has a niche in the forest, and you won't see it very often.
So what about wiring them in?
Yes. Yeah, I think if you have cool species and you want to protect them and you're noticing deer pressure on them, go for it. It's not necessarily reasonable to do that everywhere on the landscape, but on your own property, absolutely. Protect that, and I think it's wonderful.
Okay, great. Judy wants to know, she said she was on a conversation with a county forester a few weeks ago, and someone mentioned witch's broom in connection with ash trees. And the answer was, you don't worry about witch's broom with ash trees, but you worry about them in your blueberries. So she said she noticed witch's broom in her blueberries, but didn't do anything. And should she do something? And if so, what?
Yeah, so witch's broom is a mutation where you get a lot of buds that explode out of like one spot on a twig. And for blueberries, you worry about it because those areas aren't going to produce. It's not a very strong branch, and you're not going to get blueberries off of those areas. So cutting it out, getting rid of it, it takes up a lot of space. Getting it out of there, any sort of like disease or mutation you want to get out of your blueberries, especially, or any fruit trees. In ash trees, we do worry about it because it is one of the signs of emerald ash borer. So it's a reaction to stress in ash trees, and you can get a lot of growth in one area, and it's because the emerald ash borer is restricting growth in another area of the tree, and it's being stressed. So definitely interesting when you see it, especially in ash trees, because we've got all eyes on ash trees right now looking for signs for emerald ash borer. But they also, you'll see them in lots of trees too. So it is kind of on the landscape, and as a whole, we don't really worry about it. But when we're looking for signs for emerald ash borer, or if you're trying to grow blueberries, you might be concerned about witch's broom.
Great. We have someone that asked if you would go into more detail about TSI work. How do you determine which trees to release, and generally how much space around a released tree is best?
Yeah, so which trees to release, a lot of it depends on what your goals are as the landowner. So we are always trying to release healthy, vigorous trees, especially if your goal is to kind of promote forest health and also to grow good timber species. If you have goals as a landowner, maybe to promote species diversity, you're noticing maybe your forest is lacking species diversity, then you might choose to release a few trees that are not necessarily the healthiest or most vigorous, but you want to keep those seeds on the landscape, and you want to promote those in your forest. So that might be a goal. And so you would maybe look around your forest and see which trees are the unique ones, and release around those. But generally we're looking for health and vigor. You might also look around, and if your goal is timber production and high quality timber products, then you want to look at which tree species meet those goals. So you might be looking at your hardwood species. You might really want to have a sugar bush in the future, and you might want to promote sugar maple, and that kind of fits both niches for high value forest products and sawlogs, and also for sugaring. So you might choose that tree as kind of a multi-purpose tree. You might be promoting wildlife, and so you might be looking really hard for some trees that would be great for wildlife, like something that would produce mass, so cherries or oaks or hickories, something like that. So the way you choose trees really depends on your goals, and then the health of those trees. And then you also, another thing I skipped over is that you want to look at the site, and you want to be growing trees that are really appropriate for that site. So that can be a little tricky to like an untrained eye, and that's where it might be great to have a forester on your property to help you through that, because the trees that are growing there at that point in time might not be the exact trees that should be there. Like a lot of times white pine will come into a site really early on, and that might not be the best tree suited for that site. So you might want to select against that to promote other trees like hardwoods that might be better on that site. So it's a lot of information, but you want to look at, I think health is the number one. A lot of people can kind of tell what a healthy looking tree looks like. And then the space aspect kind of depends on the size of the tree. So if they're really small, you don't want to give them a ton of space right away. You can really do TSI at any stage. You don't have to wait until it's a certain size or anything, especially if you're putzing around on your property and you enjoy it like I do. You can start doing that work really early on, choosing which species you want to promote and things like that. But if you have really small trees, like a couple inches in diameter, you want to go slow at first. Those trees are really used to being packed in there, and you don't want to release them too fast. If you do, they can be really susceptible to ice damage and snow and things like that, and just the amount of sunlight all at once too. So depends on if they've been released before. Also, you might see that they're chugging along healthy and give them extra space again. And so you can expand. A lot of it comes down to not necessarily the spacing of the stems, but the spacing of the crowns. And so you're looking up and looking at what's competing with the crown of the tree that you want to promote. And if something is encroaching on its space, backing up and giving it more space. So generally it's like 5 to 10 feet of space around the crown is kind of a good goal. And so if you cut a couple trees and you say like, okay, it looks like there's plenty of space on this side, then maybe you wait a couple years and go back. It depends also on how often you want to be in there. So there's a lot of it depends in this scenario, but I'm happy to also talk with people one-on-one. I love TSI work. I think it's a great way to be out in the woods and enjoy the woods, and you can really get some impressive work done. You can look back and see it in that afternoon and then in the years to come.
Great. And for those on the call who don't know, TSI, I don't know if I said it when I asked the question or you said it, and the answer is Timber Stand Improvement, TSI work. So we have a question from Kelly about invasives. She wants to know, when hand pulling certain invasive species such as garlic mustard or poison parsnip, rather than using herbicide, what do you recommend in terms of disposal to prevent further spread? She's been letting them sit in bags to rot and then burning them, but are there other disposal methods to safely dispose of pulled invasives without risking further spread? She says, I assume throwing bags into the dumpster is not best.
Yeah, so letting them rot in bags is really the best way to deal with them. Different kinds of plastic will help things decompose faster. So really cooking them under some clear plastic can help, but I'm not super familiar with disposal methods other than the bag method. I can think on it and get back to you, but I'd say letting them rot in bags. You gotta really watch it. Definitely don't throw them in your compost pile. They'll just spread and take off. Don't throw them like anywhere really on the ground. They'll root very easily. So making sure that they're dead. I'm curious if they're rotten and mushy and then burning them, how the burning goes. I guess you'd have to have a pretty hot fire, but that sounds like a good way to really make sure everything's dead.
I did put in the chat box the link or the website for VT Invasives. That's a great website for people to go to learn more about a specific invasive species, how to identify it, how to control it, both mechanically or with herbicides, different methods that you can take to control the invasives, and then it also addresses disposal. So that's a great website for every specific invasive species that we have, and we have many.
Thank you.
Here's another invasive question. How do you control bittersweet from climbing on a plantation of black walnut trees?
Yeah, bittersweet's a tough one. You really the tried and true method, and a lot of people hate this answer, I guess, but herbicide is the best way to deal with things like vines, especially like bittersweet. It's very hard to remove mechanically. The roots, when you pull on them, they seem to snap, and you can't get any foothold with pulling the roots. If you can't get the roots of them, they're just going to keep coming back. And so herbicide is a way to kill the plant, and the plant draws the herbicide into its roots, and you're able to kill it. It is frustrating. I understand for some people that don't want to use herbicide, but it's kind of, I heard somebody else say that's a necessary evil. If we don't want invasives on our landscape, we don't have enough time and hands to hand pull all of them. And so I think mechanically removing them, I'm getting a little bit off on invasives, but mechanically removing them, I think if you have the time and the commitment, is wonderful. Don't rule it out. Doesn't mean that every invasive plant needs to be treated with herbicide, but there are some, like bittersweet, where it's just really tough to get it, especially if it's got a foothold and it's got a good root system. It's just going to keep coming back. So if the stems are large enough, you can cut the stem and then dab concentrated herbicide right on the stem, and it's very controlled. And you can really target that plant specifically in that area. If it's a lot of little shoots, it's a little bit more difficult, and it's harder to kill through foliar spraying the leaves, but it is also possible. So that's my answer. I understand, and I understand why it's frustrating that herbicide is promoted the way it is. Like, some people just feel uncomfortable, but it's very safe. They've done a lot of studies on targeted control with herbicide, and that's sometimes the way to go.
Let's see, someone asked, I have thorny black locusts. Are they beneficial trees? And what does that say about my land?
So black locust, it depends on where you are, whether it's considered invasive or not. Generally, what it says about your land is that it's an old homestead, and those trees were brought at some point and planted in that area. A lot of times you'll see old cellar holes and things around, old apple trees and cellar holes and wells around areas where there's black locust. So there are areas of Vermont where black locust really can take over and overwhelm a stand and acts invasively. But there are other areas in Vermont, generally in southern Windsor County, black locust acts as a part of the stand, and we want to proceed with caution because we know it can act invasive, but generally it doesn't outcompete other species, and it kind of fits in a niche. So if you're seeing that it is really becoming a monoculture of black locust, that can be concerning. But I would say if it doesn't seem like it's overwhelming a stand and out regenerating other things, then treat it like part of the stand. And there is a market for black locust. There's fence posts, and it's very rot resistant wood, so it's sought after for certain types of projects. But yeah, I treat it like the part of the stand unless it starts to act like it's overwhelming things.
Great. So I have a question. Do you have a favorite tree species? What is it and why?
Oh, I feel like I'm always changing my answer to this one. I really like yellow birch. I think that it is just really cool in every stage of its life cycle, or every stage of its life. So as a young tree, I think it's really neat. It's got really pretty bark. That's kind of first drawn to it. It's very pretty. And then just how massive they can get. Every once in a while, you'll be walking around the woods and stumble across just this massive old yellow birch that's been there forever. They're usually pretty rotten inside. I've heard from one of the bear biologists with Fish and Wildlife that they found several bear dens inside yellow birch trees. And I just think they're so cool, especially when they get so big and giant, and they barely look like the yellow birch you see generally growing in the forest. The bark looks completely different. But I love so many trees, and I find all of them unique.
You're not the first person who said that about yellow birch. It's actually made me think more about yellow birch in general. So thanks for sharing.
Yeah, we heard that from Tony D'Amato the other night.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Tim wants to know what material exists for educating landowners on timber stand improvement. Is there any resources or materials that you could recommend?
Yeah, let's see, I can't think of anything right off the top of my head, but I know I have a bunch of them, and I will dig around. Is there a place I could post them or something like that?
We could probably post them on the YouTube, and then I can share them.
Okay. Yeah, I know the one that immediately comes to mind is the one that I used with NRCS. And that has some basic information. Then there's some guides on crop tree release specifically. So there are you'll hear foresters talk about timber stand improvement in some different categories, and it gets a little bit into the weeds of just jargon and what we call things. But crop tree release is when you're really focused on individual trees and giving those individual trees some room. And yeah, there's a guide here that Northern Research Station put out that I can share with people. Then yeah, I'm having a hard time thinking exactly of the names of the publications, but I'll look through all my stacks of resources and get back to you.
Suns good. Someone's asking how you get rid of honeysuckle.
So honeysuckle responds to foliar spray of herbicide really well. It's fairly easy to kill. It's prolific on the landscape, but it's actually one that's not that hard to control when you can identify it and start to control that on your property. So foliar spray is if you have a really big area covered with herbicide, that's the easiest way. And then once those plants are dead, they're very brittle and they break down quickly. If you have a few small plants, then you can pull them. You want to make sure you get the root, and you always want to make sure that you are keeping an eye on those areas where you first found those plants, so marking them in some way. You can pull them. It's easiest to pull plants when the soil is moist. So after rain or this time of year or in the fall when we kind of get our fall mud season, you can pull plants easier. Pulling plants is great if you just have a few and you go across them, but you want to make sure you're rechecking those areas. You can't assume that you've got them all, and there's always seeds. So the plants probably got there from birds bringing seeds or spreading from an adjacent property, and you want to make sure you're keeping an eye on those things. And then I've also heard some people have success with going by, if you don't think you can pull it, if it's a large plant, going through and cutting the stems and just repeatedly cutting the stems as often as you see shoots, really, and depleting its root energy. So that I've heard, I've never done that personally, but I've heard that that can be effective. And it also is very effective if you don't think that you can, well, let me back up. If you see it with fruiting bodies, absolutely try and like get the plant dead as fast as possible, because you don't want those fruits to mature and spread. So sometimes cutting those plants and knowing, okay, I need to come back to this, and it's not a done deal, but at least it's not spreading seed for another year. That I highly suggest that, because the more seeds you have out there, the more chance you have for plants on your land.
Okay. Judith wanted to know, she said she was looking at something regarding EAB, and there was a presenter that mentioned something called ash elm. And she'd never heard of that before, and she was wondering, is it ash? Is it elm? Is that just like a local term? Have you heard that?
Never heard of that before. No, I wonder if there was maybe a miscommunication. I know that some people have mistaken dead ash tree, or mistaken dead elm trees for ash trees, because you've got that site image of what a ash tree looks like with emerald ash borer in it and woodpecker flecking, and driving by quick, I know that there have been several dead elm trees mistaken. So maybe that's the only thing that really comes to mind.
Okay, great, thanks. Another question about Asian bittersweet. They've been pulling Asian bittersweet and native grapevines for about 5 years, and now they notice that the trees are dying without the vines on them. Is it possible that these vines are killing trees below the soil?
It's possible that they're girdling the trees below, girdling the roots. Yeah, it's definitely possible that there's issues with root girdling and restricting water in the roots. If the roots can't function, then the tree isn't going to function.
All righty. So I have a question. I usually ask this of most of the foresters. You guys go out in the woods and you're exposed to the option of coming home with ticks. What do you do to keep yourself safe in the woods?
So, yeah, we do daily tick checks in our house. My husband's also a forester, and our daughter likes to be outside a lot. So, and we have animals. So we do, yeah, nightly tick checks all the time. And I would say that's the best way to really get ahead of getting a tick-borne illness, is to just check yourself head to toe every night. Just get in the habit. As soon as the snow's melted, you can't assume that there's a day that you can't pick up a tick. I had a tick the other day that I didn't really go outside much that day, and I had a tick on me. So I think it must have come from our animals. So that's number one, is really just being diligent. No matter what you do when you go out in the woods, just every night checking. taking a shower is even better. Then you can really make sure that you're scrubbing all over and getting rid of ticks, and having a partner to help you to help. But going out in the woods, we have permethrin treated clothing that the state treats for us to protect us. So I have some pants and some shirts. But I don't always, I mean, out in my yard, I don't always, I'm not always wearing those or wear those in the woods. I try to avoid brushy areas, or if I do go through brushy areas, I try to check myself immediately rather than kind of waiting for the evening. So that's, yeah. Permethrin treated clothing helps a lot, but I would say for me, no matter what, it's just checking at the end of the day, every day. Because yeah, sometimes I go out in my yard in a t-shirt and I'm not wearing permethrin because I just go out, and you can pick up ticks anytime. You can pick up ticks just walking through your yard. The woods have more if you're going through brush, but you just need to be diligent about checking all the time.
Great, thanks. So if I have property and I want to put trails on my property, how can I do so responsibly? What do I need to think about?
Yes. So lots of people want to recreate on their property. That makes sense, right? So you can, first of all, consider like, where is the water on your property? I would say thinking about that in conjunction with like, where do you want to go when you want to put trails on your property? Do you want to go to a water feature? Do you want to walk the perimeter of your property? Do you want to walk through the middle? Do you have a certain stand you want to go to? But knowing where the water is and where those wet areas are will help you plan out the best way to kind of navigate with those water features and to impact them the least. Because that's a lot of what we're concerned about when we have trails through the forest, is water quality and soil erosion. And then, yeah, so keeping an eye on like where those water features are and how you might cross those or avoid them altogether, or if you have a wet area, how you might go around it or through it. And then maybe looking at what you have for existing infrastructure. So maybe they're really old roads, maybe it's really recent, you just had some logging done. But looking at what's there and working with that, if it was done responsibly, put in responsibly, or maybe not working with those areas if it wasn't done responsibly. So if it goes straight up a hillside and you already see that soil is eroding in those areas, then you probably don't want to keep using those trails. You want to find another way, maybe put some switchbacks in. I think another piece of this that I skipped right over, but did a talk not too long before the pandemic, was that it depends on what you want to do for recreation. So if you want to mountain bike, or you want to walk, or if you want to snowshoe or ski, or go with your horse or something, you're going to have different trail needs. And so keeping those in mind the whole time when you're building some trails, what your needs are as the recreator. So those are kind of important things to keep in mind. And then trail density is also important. So you want to be able to enjoy your property, but if you have a lot of trails, then things that are already on your property, like wildlife, might not be able to use it the same way. So keeping the density down and keeping other things in mind when you're out there is important too. Having a map of your property and having the contours on your map can be really helpful. Other programs like maybe Avenza Maps, where you can put a map of your property on your iPhone and take that out in the woods with you, and maybe start to plan out some routes and then take it back and sit with it for a little bit, can be really helpful. I would say if you're looking to put new trails in, the best thing to do is not do it not do the cutting and the planting at the same time. Back up a little bit, think about it, maybe lay some flags out and look at your route, and then maybe go out there just after it rained and look at the route again, see if that still makes sense. Because water, when we talk about trails, is a really big issue. So you don't want water on your trail, and you don't want to be mucking up the water. Is that answering question? Is the question?
Yeah, no, I think so. And I love the idea about water, putting in water bars to make sure. I've been in the woods with Keith Thompson, and, I learned to slow the water, spread the water, and sink the water.
Yes.
So those are the things you want to do: get it off your trail, get it spread into disperse it, and then get it to sink into the ground. So I found that to be an interesting, I remember my 3 S's.
Yeah, water's really important for trails, both like for the water and protecting the water, but also protecting your trails. You don't want to put in all this work and then have a big rainstorm and have your trail washed out and have all the soil gone. That's not good for your trail either, and all the time you put into it. But yeah, also just having a forester out with you. If you already have a forester around, they can help give you some pointers when they're out there. Just kind of look at this, maybe you want to avoid this area, and do some preliminary planning is always helpful too.
Okay, there's a follow-up question on trails. Are there guidelines under current use about building trails, or anything they need to think about if they're in current use?
So when you're in current use, most of the properties are multi-use properties, so people are using them for lots of different things. But we don't say like recreation is good or bad or anything like that. It's a lot about landowner goals, but we do require that all current use properties, it's the law to follow the AMP, so acceptable management practices. And that means installing water bars and maintaining appropriate stream crossings, and really just being responsible for water quality on your property. So so it's not specifically recreation based, but you do need to be following the AMPs on your current use enrolled property.
Can you define what an AMP is?
Sure, yeah, so it's, the acceptable management practices, and it outlines, there's a lot of details, but it outlines like the appropriate spacing for water bars and appropriate ways to cross a stream and sizing of stream crossing structures, and smoothing out ruts, and where you would, they specifically apply to logging infrastructure, or logging jobs, and the closeout you need to do for those and during logging. But we also want to see those on all the trails on current use enrolled properties. So a water bar, if anybody doesn't know, is just a berm of soil in a trail, so that the water, like Lisa said, hits it and then gets diverted. I can't remember your S's, but it slows down and spreads and sinks. Maybe I'm hitting it, sinks through the forest floor. Okay, I hadn't heard that, but I like it. And so you really, in order for those to work properly, you need the right number of them based on your slope. And so the booklet really outlines how to do that and the appropriate spacing and keeping up with them. There's a lot of maintenance that goes into it. So having trails is great, but the more trails you have, the more maintenance you also need to do. So
good point. That's a great point. Trisha wants to know, she has a small patch of woods, but this would go to much larger patches of woods as well. And she says there's a large amount of dead and downed wood. Is it healthier should she be cleaning that up, or should she be leaving it there? What should she be doing and thinking about?
Yeah, this is a common question. The more wood, the better, really, for wildlife, for soil health, just for everything, for carbon, if you're interested in that. having wood on the forest floor is great. It can really, I don't know where to start exactly, but wildlife, let's start there. It's great for wildlife because a lot of critters really like that structural diversity. It's great places for hiding. It is great for lots of invertebrates. It keeps the soil cool and moist, so things that are living in that area or eating the things that are living in that area have a great time. It can really help with regeneration. If you've just recently had a timber harvest and you're trying to regenerate a certain area, if you have slash on the ground, then you might not get as much deer browse in those areas, which is an issue in most places of Vermont, getting a lot of deer browse on our desired regeneration. And so it makes a little bit of a natural barrier for deer to not get in there and eat everything. It's also, like I said, it's great for keeping the soil cool and moist, trapping carbon in that dead wood on the ground. People are also finding and recommending, a lot of foresters are starting to recommend keeping wood on the steeper slopes so that when we get really big rainstorms in the summer, like we do occasionally now, or more often now than we used to, that as the water moves across the forest floor, it's hitting down wood barriers and kind of spreading out and slowing down. The more wood, the better, really. It is not always reasonable in some timber harvests, like if we do whole tree chip harvests, or whole tree harvest or chip harvest, and it's not always reasonable to have all that wood on the ground. Sometimes they're chipping all of the tree and taking it all off. There's different goals with those kind of harvests. So you can sometimes request that they leave a few trees and then you can fell them later and put them on the ground. We did that often with NRCS patch cuts. So asking them to leave some standing trees that you then know you'll come back and put those on the ground as your coarse woody debris to add to it. You can also have them drag tops back. It's extra work, and so for the logger, that is, it's extra work if they're doing a whole tree harvest, but the more wood, the better, and it's great for so many things. People have a hard time always understanding that. It can be messy, and humans generally don't like mess, but if you can think about all the other benefits, then try to.
Yeah, so we tell people wildlife like it messy.
Yeah.
It's a good thing. Mess is best. And my son keeps telling me that about his room, but I don't buy it there. So there's a question. If landowners are deciding to cut ash because of EAB and want to replant other trees, do you have any recommendations for trees or other plants to prevent the potential of invasives coming into the open area? And my question is a follow-up, should they be cutting all their ash trees?
So not cutting all of them. We recognize that if you have been growing those ash trees in your forest land as an economic, for economic reasons, you have been growing timber and you've been kind of counting on those trees and you're looking at now the potential of those trees being infested, we recognize that you may be looking to cut them and get your economic value out of them, but that doesn't mean you should be cutting every ash tree. So we need ash on our landscape as emerald ash borer comes through to have the species available to see what sort of resistance there is. We don't know exactly, because if we cut all of the trees, then we won't know what we may have had or may have missed out on for resistance. We've done this with other species. There are very few chestnuts on our landscape because they were really cut as soon as chestnut blight came through. People kind of panicked and cut a lot of those trees, and now we're finding that there's some resistance in that population. You also want to have ash on the landscape so that you can regenerate ash. If you don't have any trees, then you're not going to regenerate ash, and we're not going to have it in the future when there might be biocontrols, or when we might see more resistance or something. So yeah, don't cut all your ash trees. We recognize that you may be wanting to cut some, and that's fine. I'm forgetting the second part of the question though.
What should they be seeding something or planting something in its place?
So if you want to regenerate ash, then it's important to make larger openings, because ash needs a lot of sunlight to grow, especially when it's young. Well, when it's a little tiny seedling, it needs not that much light, but then in order to really get that ash to stay on the landscape and take hold, it needs, the numbers of about 1/4 acre per ash tree is what the amount of sunlight that it needs. So if you want to regenerate ash and kind of promote it on your landscape, then you need to have mature ash casting seed. And there are male and female ash, so that's another complicating factor. You need to leave enough ash, or you need to sex them before you cut them. So doing that in the fall when they have seed, so that you can promote ash on the landscape. So cutting large enough holes if you want to get ash. And then if you're thinking, maybe I don't want just ash because you're a little bit worried, and species diversity is always a great thing. If you're really interested in planting, I would first look around, see what species are in that area, maybe do some reading and see what species generally grow in that area. So if you're cutting ash out of a northern hardwood forest, you can look up some northern hardwood forest and the woodlands, wildlands. Sorry, am I getting my books? I can't remember.
Wetland, woodland, wildland.
Thank you. I knew I missed one. Wetland, woodland, wildland has great lists of species and great write-ups on different natural communities. You can do some research and see what might be growing in that area, even if it isn't, and plant those things. When we plant, it's pretty important in most areas, especially in southern Windsor, to protect those from deer. So seedlings aren't cheap when you buy them, and if you're going to plant them and put in all the time to plant them, generally we want to protect them. So you're also thinking about some sort of deer exclusion, I'm sorry, and or tubes on those trees. So I don't have an exact list. I would say look around first, and then see what's there. You don't want to plant anything that is wildly different. You don't want to plant anything that could potentially become an invasive. But we also are looking at, as the climate changes, we can look at species that are maybe a little bit more south and plant those on the landscape, because we can assume that with climate change, those will do better. So red oak's a popular one that people are starting to plant now in more, just slightly out of their range, or in their range, but where they aren't always growing, and seeing them take off and really get a foothold, because we assume that they're going to do better with climate change predictions.
Interesting. Great, thank you. So as we look at the woods right now, you know, we've been home, we're able to get out, spring is here. What are you seeing in Windsor County in terms of maybe some of the spring ephemerals, or the trees that are starting bud out, or the wildlife that are becoming more active or returning?
Yeah, so I love spring wildflowers, ephemerals. My great-grandmother was a wildflower enthusiast, so that's the first thing I key in on is wildflowers. I saw, yesterday we went for a walk, I saw blue cohosh, and I actually saw something unique. I saw I believe it was a red trillium that was white. It had a red, it had all the characteristics of a red trillium, except that the petals were white. So that was really unique. I took a picture. I'll have to send that out. I'll attach it and see if anybody knows. I didn't see any of the painted trillium out, so I'm pretty sure it wasn't that. But I've never seen this before. I saw some bloodroot not too long ago. I saw, what else? Oh, we picked some fiddleheads the other day. That's exciting. We saw some ramps also. We made a dinner of ramps and fiddleheads. And let's see, what other ephemerals am I seeing? I saw some spring beauty. I saw, lots of wild oats. I saw some trout lily. Yeah, all sorts of things around here. They're really, really popping out. Just a little bit south of us, I live in Reading, and we drove into Springfield to get some groceries the other day, and all of the serviceberry is in flower there. We're waiting for it at our house. It's not quite out. So those are all the spring flowers I've seen. We've been hearing a woodcock in our yard for quite a while now. And yeah, what else? I love spring. I get so excited about it every year. And this year, I feel like it's especially nice to just slow down a little bit and observe it every day. Where I'm not leaving the house much, so I'm really focused on what's unfolding here at my house. Yeah, it's so exciting to see the leaves coming out, and the pussy willows are over now. I've noticed that, so they've all flowered, and can't really find any pussy willows where they're really tight and kind of that classic pussy willow shape. But it's exciting that we're moving forward in spring. Yeah. Does anybody else have observations of unique things, or just things you really like?
We'll see what they type in, and
Right.
We got time for one more question. So Pat wants to know what herbicide might they use to control ferns that prevent regrowth of large areas that have been clear cut. So, the ones that are probably allopathic, I would assume.
Yeah. Yep. So I'm assuming it's probably like hay-scented fern. And they'll take over an area. And it can be really frustrating for forest landowners that have these areas that were once forested and are now ferns. So one way to herbicide them is with glyphosate. So they don't need a very concentrated solution. So it'd be foliar spraying glyphosate at about 1%. And I would suggest working with a forester or a licensed pesticide applicator that really can know the percentage and dial it in, because you don't need to put extra herbicide on the ground. And you legally shouldn't either. You should be using just the right amount. So using that right amount and foliar spraying, and the timing is really important too. So I'm not specifically sure on the timing for ferns, because it varies for every different kind of plant, and when herbicide is most effective for that plant. So it's a very small amount for ferns compared to some other plants, but that will be effective. And then you want to make sure also, anytime you're doing invasive treatment, you want to make sure that you have your future goal in mind too. You don't want to just put herbicide on the ground and then walk away. So what is the goal of controlling that invasive plant, whether it's a native invasive like fern or an actual invasive? You want to be able to say, I'm doing this because I want to maybe regenerate that area to trees, or I want to promote species diversity or native species. And so taking the kind of extra step beyond just controlling the invasive. And if you want to regenerate that area to natural, to native regeneration, then maybe you're also doing that in conjunction with a timber harvest or planting in that area once the fern's dead, something to really make a step towards your overall goal of controlling that invasive.
I've heard that word a lot today, goals. It's the landowner's goals and objectives for their property. So what do they want to see? What do they want to get out of it? And then working with a forester to reach those goals. So that's a big takeaway, I think, today. So thank you.
Yeah,
We've reached the end of our hour. Do you have anything you want to add, Hannah?
I'd say just get outside. I think this, we have an opportunity, like there isn't a whole lot we can say that's beneficial about this pandemic, except that we have maybe some more time to slow down and look at things and observe and really just feel connected to our space around us. I think most people, I'm making an assumption, but most people probably on this call have some land they can get out on and observe. And I'd say just seize that opportunity and get outside and enjoy spring in a way maybe you haven't had the chance to.
Great, thank you so much. We've really enjoyed bringing these Coffee with the County Forester to everybody. We have another one scheduled for next Friday with Hannah's counterpart for the northern half of Windsor County and Orange County, AJ Folensby. We have a number of other programs that are coming up. You can join our e-newses, as I mentioned. I put Hannah's email in the chat box. I know Kathleen has an exciting program coming up on the 19th with Mike Wojciech, who's the author of Bark, so watch for that as well. And again, VWA and Vermont Coverts, thanks you for joining us. Kathleen, do you want to add anything?
No, I think I'm good, Lisa. Thanks for all your information and knowledge there, Hannah. It's been great. We all learn something new every week. This has just been an exciting adventure. I hope we can keep it going.
All right, thank you all. Have a great weekend. Get outside and enjoy your woods.
Oh, and happy Mother's Day.
Wow.
That's right.
And you. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Hannah.
Bye.